Dames et heren, mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir et bienvenue dans cette magnifique salle Henri Leboeuf où Beaux-Arts et A+, ont le plaisir d'accueillir l'architecte Peter Märkli ce soir. Quel plaisir d'autre part de vous voir présent en si grand nombre. Peter Märkli richtte zijn bureau op in Zurich in 1978. Hij is een van de meest vooraanstaande Zwitserse architecten van dit moment en hij genoot van een opleiding bij Rudolf Olgiati en raakte geïnspireerd door het werk van de beeldhouwer Hans Josephson. Peter Märkli hecht sindsdien een fundamenteel belang aan de relatie tussen kunst en architectuur. Son travail est plein d'allusions au passé et profondément ancré dans les références de l'histoire de l'architecture. Des œuvres de l'Antiquité, ainsi que celles de la Renaissance palladienne, font partie des prototypes architecturaux sur base desquels Märkli fonde son travail et affine son langage architectural. Voor Märkli is architectuur net als de schilder of de beeldhouwkunst een taal met een eigen grammatica, syntaxis en woordenschat. Die taal moet beheerst worden om architectuur te kunnen maken en begrijpen. De basis van die architectuurtaal is volgens hem de geometrie. Een lijn, een cirkel, een vierkant of een rechthoek zijn dus fundamentele onderdelen van de architectuur. Outre le choix des matériaux et des couleurs, outre le jeu d'ombre et de lumière, l'utilisation des proportions est l'un des éléments clés déterminant la force esthétique de l'œuvre de Peter Märkli. Sa fascination pour la composition et la recherche des proportions adéquates l'ont ainsi amené à développer son propre système de relations applicable à toutes les échelles. De tekening is een ander essentieel onderdeel van het werk van Märkli. De schets is van fundamenteel belang in zijn ontwerpproces. Het tekenen laat de architect toe om bepaalde aspecten van de opdracht te onderzoeken. Aan de hand van de tekening tast hij af wat de relatie is van een kleiner element tot een groter geheel, zoals dat bijvoorbeeld het geval is bij zijn gevelcomposities. Ces différents principes et références que Märkli applique rigoureusement le mènent à produire une architecture précise et intemporelle. Avant de lui laisser la parole pour vous en dire plus, je tiens à remercier nos précieux partenaires et sponsors. Tout d'abord Beaux-Arts pour la coproduction de l'événement. Ensuite, notre partenaire structurel Febelsem, ASSA ABLOY Entrance System, le sponsor structurel, Urban Brussels, le partenaire de cette conférence, maar ook onze verschillende ondersteunende partners, de stad Brussel, het hoofdstedelijk Brussels gewest, de Vlaamse overheid en de Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles. Goedenavond allemaal.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
herzlich zu diesem Vortrag.
I wish you a warm welcome to this presentation. Now, it could be that this presentation is a sort of declaration of love for my profession. This is possible.
Also ich liebe meinen Beruf sehr.
I love my profession, I love my work, and I hope that this presentation will really shed some light on my process and how much I love my work. Now, to start off, to just show you what humans are capable of doing. Now, this is a very famous work by Marcel Duchamp featuring a typewriter. Now, on the right, you see quite a small piece of equipment. There's about 26 letters, a few punctuation marks. And what is actually very surprising is that these abstract punctuation marks, these letters, make it possible for us to produce something very factual, something that's very clear, while at the same time we can also express emotions. So this small piece of equipment gives us the possibility to produce all of the books that we have filling our libraries, and it's capable of expressing every thought that man has ever had. And so when I was preparing this presentation, I thought that this image was quite appropriate.
ist mir das so
I have used a typewriter as an example before, and then while preparing for this presentation, I came to know about this work by Marcel Duchamp. So it's much more than just knowledge about something. Now, my profession is much more than just geometry. Now, when we talk about geometry and we talk about basic shapes, we can combine them to create radical shapes. Let's look at the circle.
Kreis überall denselben Abstand
In a circle is basically a set of points which are exactly the same distance from one point in the middle.
Es ist das Quadrat, es ist das
Then
gleichzeitige
you
Dreieck,
have a quadrilateral, then you have square, and then you have all sorts of variations of a quadrilateral.
vielen Rechteckige,
You can create all sorts of quadrilaterals with different angles. From a triangle, you can create all sorts of different figures.
ist vielfach als ein Achteck dargestellt.
Often you can convert a circle into an octagon.
Daraus
You can create an ellipse from a circle.
ikonische Elemente,
And furthermore, we can use these figures to create architectural elements. Now, what's most interesting is when you look at this line, though, we often can combine these lines to create cities and to also create spaces in a building.
sind die
So,
Grundelemente
from my point of view, these are the basic elements of architecture.
eingeschränkter.
To limit the scope even further, I think we have a much more limited number of elements than this typewriter here. But nonetheless, without actually limiting creativity, you can create an infinite number of options from these few basic shapes.
Herzen auf dem, was in einer Epoche gerade der Lebenswunsch ist, den man darstellt. Und wir haben einen alten Beruf,
We have
es
a
gibt
profession that goes back many years.
die unbestritten ist,
There is a degree of communication that cannot be refuted. So, for communication, we have language, but communication also goes beyond that. You also have communication that deals with communicating something through the eyes. And this eye, this vision,
das heißt, man hat
is something that I have made my life really, looking at nature, looking at architecture, and the idea is to fine tune this eye and this vision. And often in Switzerland, at least, you don't really study vision. You don't really study the eye. For 12 years, you study grammar and language, but I never really studied vision and perspective.
habe dann glücklicherweise
Thankfully, though, when I started studying architecture under an amazing architect, Mr. Flims, from Flims, Rudolf Olschiati, and then I was also lucky to meet Hans Josefsson in Zurich, and thus I was able to develop this perspective. I grew up in this trinity of sorts with Olschiati and Josephson.
ein Gebäude, das ich
Now,
nach der ETH
this is
78 entworfen habe, ein
a house
Doppelhaus,
that
Doppelhaus,
I designed while working at the ETH in 1978.
Spezielles hat.
It's a two-family house,
Wenn man zusammenbaut, ist das kein Reihenhaus.
and basically when you build this together, you basically have a central area that is shared, and on the left you have one family, on the right another. And in this big central area,
Zwei Säulen.
you have two columns demarcating it.
Besitzen kein Kapitell.
These two columns, however, are not finished by a dome on top. Why is there no dome on top?
Ein langes Gespräch.
And now this was a long discussion, really. Why is there nothing topping off these two columns? And I had to keep going back to the method actually taught by Olgiati.
Keine sprachlichen Mittel mehr.
And often it was very difficult for me to communicate my message because often we don't have the words really to describe what we're going for, what we're developing with this perspective. So at that point, my intention was to create an atmosphere, create an emotion. So you have emotional intelligence, which helps you to take up atmosphere and feeling in nature and spaces. And the idea for me is always to create a specific feeling, a specific atmosphere. And there are also feelings that I wanted to avoid creating. And that has really been the work that I've always looked at. And here you have a quadrilateral, and then you have these columns that then divide up this square space. Here you have the entryway, and here you have the entryway that then leads to the upper floors. There is a parallel narrow corridor, and I had to keep that corridor quite small because I used quite a lot of space for the central entryway. And now here you can see how something like this is actually created, how it can be produced. So there on the bottom you had the building that we built, and it has a very specific dimension. These specific dimensions are based on experience. When you actually deal with proportions and dimensions, that's how you end up. That's what you end up with. Rudolf Volgati, who was my physics teacher in high school, he highlighted such structures. So he drew inspiration from Greek columns. That's what he built there in the entryway of the house on the right. And you just have a small square entryway created as a result. And then the shadow was the main creation. The columns are not heavy, they're not solid, but in fact, these are structures well known and seen quite often. And the intention was always the same, to basically dematerialize something that was load bearing. This is what architects can achieve even today. And however, I do find it a tragedy that we can't really build something like this anymore. And that was my introduction really to this profession. This was a way for us to figure out what we could build, what we were capable of building.
Nächstes. Das sind Skizzen,
So now, these are sketches. I always make sketches for projects. Without sketches, I really can't build. And now here you can see the columns used as elements there. You also see that one side is slimmer than the other. These are the major elements, but at the same time, you will see that this is not a very specific drawing. You have columns that actually create two different areas. On the right, you have a relief by Josephson. And then in the center, it's not completely open, but there's in fact a column. Here, once again, a sketch of the entryway. Now you have the plans. This is the kitchen. A long, narrow entryway. You have a bookcase, and then you have a staircase going up through the narrow corridor. The upper floor, this has a convex effect around the corners. And to make this possible, I had to create two narrow rooms. The window was in the middle, So I wasn't exactly sure about how I could do this.
Zimmer. Und das da ist diese Fassade
And then
gespannt wurde.
you have
Habe
the
diesen Plan
facade in the front.
gezeichnet gehabt.
This is the plan that
Es ist
I
nicht zu
drew
sehen,
up,
ist kein Armbau
and as you
oder
can
nichts daran.
see, that it's still very bare.
Plan.
But I was very happy with the plan.
Es hat kein Bad gegeben.
I was very happy with the plan, but it's very sparse and there's no bathroom. So what exactly does the architect do? How can you build a house without a bathroom?
Es war ganz rasch
So
zu denken, ja, ich
very
baue jetzt
quickly, I had to decide, okay, yes, I'll just add a bathroom there near the corridor, like a 18th century house.
noch ein Nachbarhaus ist, ein Fenster,
And then
Beziehung.
the fact that you have the bathroom, you then also have a window to create some relation between the two elements. And then I could just give up and say, well,
Macht einen Widerstand.
this plan is fine, I'll just continue. But I could also think, how do I create this interplay? How do I make it work? And so that's what was my point of departure. I knew that this was a long space, this was a corridor.
Apparate, die so in der Schweiz in einem
And
Bad
so
stehen, habe ich
the different elements that are usually found in a Swiss bathroom, I tried to set that up along this narrow corridor. Well, firstly, a toilet. The toilet should have a degree of privacy. Sure. All right. A sink. Now, the sink can be open. It can be open in the corridor.
im Rhythmus von diesem
And in this way, keeping in mind the rhythm of the light flowing through the corridor,
geben haben.
I could then fit in a bathroom and a bathtub at the end. The toilet is closed, as is the bathtub, and then you have an open sink.
Heizung.
The top floor of this house has no heating.
Im großen Geschoss, das zuerst gesehen.
On the ground floor, quite a large room as you saw, there are large marble sheets with heating in the floor.
Ja, die Wärme steigt. Also, wir bauen nur einen Bretterboden, können
So
diesen können diese
we decided then
an den Beton hängen.
that instead of having marble, then we could have wooden flooring, and this wooden flooring could directly be kept on the concrete floor,
Wenn's mal ein
and we could thus save some money. And if it actually gets too cold on the top floor, you could always just set up an electric space heater for the few months that is required. And that's how then we ended up with the structure of this house. And now coming back to the columns.
Säule nicht von der Mykenä
Now,
her geleitet wird.
these
Und es ist
columns
so, dass ich
are not monoliths.
kompletten Sprachschatz zurückgewinnen wollte.
I wanted to go back to the language of architecture that was found in this ancient profession that is architecture to create these columns.
Die erste Vergangenheit ist, die man anschauen muss.
The recent past
Dass die
is not the first past we need to look at.
nächsten Vergangenheit
It could be that the situation in the
nicht verstanden habe, weil
ancient past, for me it was the classic modern period, could be something that could determine our present and our future.
total anderen gesellschaftlichen Notwendigkeiten.
There were very different social conditions back then,
Es ist ganz
and the society we live in now and the needs we have now are different. So it's very important to know this difference, to be aware of it, but we have to look back in the past, not to find and identify a kind of chronology, but in fact to figure out that, yes, this element had a purpose, I should reuse it today as well. Oh, this did not actually contribute a use, I'm going to avoid it. Classicism, for example, did not give me much use, so I do not take that up. But to the Renaissance period, I can look back there for many more elements because there was a lot of use in what was provided then. So you have to look at purpose, at function. And this is something I always tell my students as well. The classical perspective, the classical modern perspective, this is something we have to be critical of. We have to be critical of it. We have to understand what they thought and why they thought as they did back then. But this has no application now to us today. It is not
Soll ich
relevant.
jetzt die
But
Einfachverglasung in
our
ein dünnes Stahlrämmchen oder
perspective
direkt in den Beton
has to be different
hinein?
on this. Should I just think of a thin glass sheet for windows that directly goes into the concrete? Or should I create a frame within which
In der
I
Schweiz haben wir
set up the glass
mittlerweile
instead?
bei einer Dreifachverglasung
And now in Switzerland, we've gone beyond single and double glazing and we're at triple glazing.
das hat
And so,
nichts mehr
this, of course, cannot be compared to
Wirkungen, die die
the
klassische Moderne
tension effect and the effects created by classical modernism,
in dünnen Fenstern
where you had walls and these very thin, delicate windows. But if you go back to the Renaissance, for example,
am Canal Grande, die gotischen Bauten
if you look at Gothic structures,
am Fenster,
where you had thick walls and the windows were shaped differently, you will discover that there are elements that you can in fact use, that you can also propagate today. So I'm not saying that don't look back on classical patterns and classical creations, but in fact we have to look back to see what we can use. Art is not something that we create from new, that we create ourselves. But in fact, you look at the work that has been done by previous generations, we use that as the basis to then move forward.
aufbaut auf Arbeit.
You have been able to move forward because you're building on work that has been done in the past. And if you keep this in mind, it's also important to relate to the same, to take up the past and see what we can do with it. This might seem a bit unfortunate because everyone is inventing new things, and I'm saying that all inventions can be traced back to an old example. But in art, creation is not invented of new. Just like language, we formulate ourselves based on a grammar that exists, and we determine the future based on the past.
Aber aus Gewohnheit einfach nicht über die Säule zu sprechen, das ist nicht erlaubt.
Now,
Das heißt,
one might say you're not allowed to build a column in a certain way. And due to habit, one might say that no, you cannot build a column this way, you shouldn't. But I don't think that's a good idea. Many architects do not work with columns anymore, though I think that this was an amazing element. And so we have to ask the question, why don't we build columns anymore? And if we do not ask the question why, we will not be able to move forward. We will not be able to have this enlightenment, this moment to figure out why we have changed one way or the other. Science works in a similar way. You also need to ask the question, why? Now, that was my little bit on columns. I really miss this as an element. And now, when I was building the columns, I tried a couple of times and often they collapsed. And then I also realized that, well, you can't force people, but I do hope columns will make a comeback because I really do love this element.
das sind dann die Schalungen auf
Now, here, this was at the construction site.
eine Säulenschalung und hier steht oder liegt der Säulenschaft.
Here is a column that I'm trying to build, and here one that's fallen over.
Das ist das Gebäude.
And now here you have the building.
Es ist
As you can see,
das Gewicht über diese
the two strips have been done away with.
eigentlich das Zentrum fürs Auge,
And you see that the column structure
dieses mittlere
is the center. It's where your eyes are immediately drawn.
Zentrum auf dieses mittlere Band anlege.
And then once this center point has been determined, there's already a degree of symmetry. And thus I could see that I could do away with elements that I had in my previous drawing.
Fast im Zentrum gemacht und
And thus
Schräge der Figur
we were able to have the columns in the center as well.
stand gegenüber der gebauten.
And thus we were also able to create a degree of relief to the symmetry of the building. At the same time, the room was supposed to be intimate, quite small. And we were able to achieve all of these goals and at the same time create this lightness of structure with the columns. We also consider leaving some space in the center blank. And that is very archaic, really, to put the columns in the middle. But if you were to visit Italy, if you were to look at Greek temples as well, you will always see that there's a central column as well, a central column accompanied by other elements. You have many other examples that you could look at. But I do remember how students came and said that professors don't accept this as design. You're not allowed to do this. So I had to say, well, okay, let me look back in history. And then maybe I can give you examples as to why this should be accepted. I have examples here to show you how this has worked. So, in certain cases, you can often create new language for architecture as well. So, up until now, things were the strong emotions of an architect that were on display, but language becomes very limited as a result. And now, this limited language is not just about the fact that we're trying to build something, but this very limited language can also be quite injurious. And now, through my years, I came across Barnett Newman. In a newspaper article in 1984, if I'm not mistaken, Newman said that the Americans had completely abstract ideas and the Europeans cling to facts and objects. And just like the Europeans who have been able to change objects and facts into something spiritual, the Americans can also transform their abstract thoughts into pictures, into a real experience. And keeping this thought in my mind, taking this thought by Newman as a starting point, I now come to my profession. Often my profession begins with an area. You have a number of square meters, but you don't have any sensory effect. You don't have an atmosphere of feeling. And our profession obliges us to take these naked figures and to transform them into something that creates a feeling both inside and outside. This feeling is there to get people involved. We build to create a certain emotion, to elicit a certain emotion from people. Now, here you have architecture from the Middle Ages, where you have these big central plazas or squares. And there you have a kind of vertical void that is created. So, in big squares, you have this large space and this large relationship with the sky. And so you have closed areas around you, but the relationship is vertical with the sky. And in this way, our feelings are also vertical in a way, because in a way, the human being also stands vertically. So that were the Middle Ages. And then here you have the Via Julia in Rome. Via Julia is different. You have a horizontal street with individual buildings that create the space for this road. And each of these buildings have their own character, but here we're focusing on the street. And then You have the landscape in the different villages where you have these smaller plots, and all of this is equally wonderful city planning. And this is what creates lines.
Dann gibt es ebenfalls
And here we can also see street-based spaces. These are the avenues in Paris, Haussmann's project.
ebenfalls einen geschlossenen Straßen.
These streets have closed street spaces. But when you walk down these large avenues, you can see that the facades were not built individually, but were actually foreseen as a whole. The rhythm of the openings is individualized, is particular, but the rest was actually planned. Now, classical modernity and the highest point of declaring public spaces as no longer being important and placing individuals into closed spaces. I'm against this because I find neighborhoods are important for life, and public spaces must be conceived in terms of a way in which society can live together in a social and political manner. Therefore, please, this is something that we should not build. Or would you like to continue building like this in the future? I like Corbusier as an artist, but in building cities, this was a great mistake, and it is important for me to reiterate this here today. Back to Haussmann. The streets are conceived here just like I think they should be conceived. You know when this was built, but today this can no longer be made in this same way, and that is because our society no longer has a strong civil society which actually has political power. In the 19th century, Europe had colonies. We owned the world, so to speak. And that is how architecture was then also used to express our relationship as Europeans with the rest of the world. Today, we are a pluralist society. And we have 3 or 4 political ways in which societies are constructed. And that is why we can no longer build in this manner. However, if we love streets and our neighbors, then we can look back to Via Giulia in Rome. And there we saw that there was a uniform street. However, houses were all individualized. The facades were individualized. Next slide. And here we can see what happens when one person does one thing and another does the next. This is quite different than urban sprawl in the 19th century. Here we can see that buildings are actually isolated and no longer have a relationship to the streets. These things have just been cut up and pasted together in any way. Architects should actually give constructors all of the proper instructions. And then at least 50% of the work or of the results of the work should actually be not for the contractor, but for the people who are then going to see the buildings in everyday life. I am really against terraced housing because this creates an ideal way of life for each and every individual apartment, but nothing for the collective. And here we have a project. This is in Zurich. It was inspired by Modernity, of course. And here we can see that there are more windows which look at the street. This is also in Zurich, a bit outside of the city center. This is called the 19th century neighborhood. There's an enormous cemetery. And then there is a new area which was built next to the cemetery. We looked at this entire street. There are important crossings here. There are also shops. But between these important crossings, there are simply houses for living. There are lines here cutting through empty space. And the idea here is that we had to reinterpret the lines because there is a park and access to the park. And this is about 80 meters broad. It's very broad. And that is why here we had to leave this space. If we know how such a line works, then we can achieve much. Our profession mainly creates open spaces, and we also need to take decisions within empty spaces. It is truly the void, the space between the pillars, and it is in that void where we can truly determine whether an architect has worked in the right way or not. When we look at the void, that is when we really feel an emotion of something that overwhelms us. A city is always something that we need to conceive as a void space, and then we need to build the space. This is the space next to the cemetery with urban farming plots. And here we suggested that we build up these lines within large empty spaces. The buildings here are not as tall, and there are always empty spaces between the buildings. There are few buildings which are quite high, as the main facades to the cemetery, and then the main facades facing the streets, and then there is private open space with gardens. And that is also where we have a memorial. And this is 16 meters large, and we thought that we could have a space which would be open as a counterpart to the cities, to the streets filled with cars. There are all kinds of different layers overlapping, and sometimes in intermediate spaces we can see open spaces, and sometimes there is a relationship of osmosis between these empty spaces. And sometimes there are other lines cutting through the lines which are parallel to each other. We can see that this kind of structure can be built and has been built in the past and can continue being built. Here, there was one element which this is, so to speak, a parasite, and we had to bring this in properly so that we would have a proper balance between the void and the spaces which are filled with buildings. Here is the model, the design, and you can see all of these buildings next to the cemetery. Here, this is on the street side. We built up these two buildings. First of all, there are these quite low rises, and then there are living spaces, then there are garages and gardens on top of these. And then there is a space in front of the gardens, a pergola. And then here there are spaces for laundries. And then here we cut back on the space a little bit and created an access to the cellars and then the garages. Here on the front side, we can see plastic features. The design here is, of course, very obvious. We can see that there is access to the street spaces. If the living quarters are open, we can look out onto the street. And there is lateral access to these living quarters. I don't know what is the case now, but when I was a student, in the middle, that was always the space where teachers told us this is where there's no light, and this is truly where we have to have these spaces such as closets and rooms where we can store things. And here there is an empty space. All of the different rooms really are part and connect to the facade. And that is why we have this broader space in back. This is also a possibility with the social housing projects that I led. This is also very interesting because sometimes you do not necessarily want to be in rooms which are filled with light, but it's particularly interesting because rooms on the inside are rooms from which you can look from the darkness into the light, emerging, so to speak, into the light. And then upstairs, the space was somewhat trimmed down. And here we can see the broad inside space. You can see that there's always a true relationship with daylight. And a little niche space where you can look at the garden and the street. This is the living spaces with all of the children's toys. And this is how the whole setup looks on the street. There are vertical openings. The walls are vertical. Everything is a very vertical structure. The access, there's a large space here. These stripes on the windows, they were created to explain the relationship between the inside and the outside. If a building is not interesting from the outside, but it is interesting from the inside, then what happens? What does the architect do? Then, of course, the architect has to also consider the price and perhaps has to build something else from the outside. We can't simply put a wall here, but we can draw these stripes. And if these stripes are black, we can create an optical illusion so that the human eye thinks that proportions on the outside are proportionate with how this window will then function and the impression that it will give us from the inside. And here we have these little plots outside with some green. You can admire this if you ever come to Zurich. So these are gardens so that the people who walk past these buildings walk past gardens and not simply containers. The garbage containers are normally put onto the streets directly in Zurich. But here, these will be kept within these green spaces. I find it truly barbaric that everything is such as rubbish cans and which is not part of the private spaces is simply put outside into the common spaces onto the street. Barbaric. And here, this is called entasis. Now, if you take a circle and transform it into a pillar, you have a cylinder, and entasis has one main reason, and it is that it is flexible. There are other semiotic explanations, but
the
most important one for me is that it is flexible. Now, the question is whether a pillar can also have entasis, or whether this in absentia could also recall a certain capital structure. These are the front sides. Next, please. And here we can see big lodges with these brown awnings. We can see the pergola between the gardens and the private gardens with the garages. There will be greenery that grows here. This is the space in between with the gardens. Once again, we tried to not have a clear limitation between one space and the next. We tried to have a sort of a zipper principle, that both of these spaces flow into each other. And this is the urban planning. And then there were two more rows of houses back there. In Tessin, this is in the southern canton of Switzerland, there's a small village in the north of that canton. And you can admire the river there and also a beautiful church, San Nicola. we found a space here that did not have any buildings on it. It's beautiful next to the train tracks and next to the river. It would no longer be possible nowadays to build a building in Switzerland outside of the places designed for urban planning. The two typologies of Josephson are the ones that we truly wanted to work with. These are two typologies that we wanted to use to build a house. This is the plan. Earlier on, you heard me speaking about the spaces in between, the void and the lines. And here you can see where I erased most parts. It's where there were two things which were the same length. And I didn't just want to have a gap. This is the type of working process. You have a certain idea of what you want to do. I simply erase. Someone, a writer, may do something different. I don't like to write. When I write one page, it takes so much energy from me. A writer just sees a comma and a word, and he simply deletes that word. And this is more or less what we do in architecture. Just like a writer deleting a word, I choose to use an eraser. Here we can see these longer lines. I'm showing you this quite on purpose. It's not because I am from the past. I am truly interested in the future. However, we cannot simply jump into the future via working with computers. I can do this work with simply an eraser and a pen in a cafe, in bed, or anywhere. Just look at Japanese art. The fewer lines are on a piece of paper, the more beautiful something becomes. If we have too much overcrowding the piece of paper, it becomes less beautiful. How did great architects begin their designs? Simply with a little bit of a brush stroke, a little bit of a form. Therefore, beauty truly lies in being minimalistic. This is a sequence of narrow spaces. This is about 4 meters 63. It's very narrow. This actually doesn't really exist. And then in this last space, we have a figure there in the end. And we wanted to have these spaces rowed like this, because this is a house which is in line with the two typologies. The door is asymmetrical, and the works from the 50s that the artist created are exhibited here. And then there is, of course, the wall to the street. The house is somewhat projected away from the street. And then we can see this asymmetrical door, and then there is a further room. This is the cut. Some of the works here really demanded these very big and high rooms. Josephson's work, so that it could be exhibited properly, we really had to work with spaces which were open and highly open. There's a specific material that we used here. It's a very expensive material called Copolit, in German at least. And according to how thick this material is, we can play with the light, and this can be put on top of the construction immediately, and it impedes any shadows from being created, and that is how we have a form of diffused light.
Now, on the outside, we had to create this space. On the outside, it had to look a certain way, but within, I knew that I could do what I wanted in terms of how sound waves as well would travel. Now, the main focus were definitely the works, the fact that the works would be hanging in the space. And that's how we really came up with this design. It would be great if the builder could just build things however he wanted and everything else would just work out simply. But this was, I would call, a calculated coincidence. This was a way for us to create relationships in this space. And we here had iron bars that were interlaced together to be load-bearing, and thus you can just have these iron bars, and then you have bolts that can just be hammered in to create a structure. And this was something that we employed to create these large open spaces. And then these were then covered with the Copolit material. So here in the space we had Josephson's works from the 50s. He was endangered, he was threatened, in fact, during the Second World War. And there was a possibility of a Third World War breaking out. And he didn't really think about that, but he in fact tried to work through this time through his art. Hitchcock as well made some works, birds for example, that were not so harmless in themselves. Now as you go inwards, you had works that Josephson then created with his life partner or life partners. Here you see the aesthetic changes a bit, and then you have the half heads, the half figures. Now, one thing was very important in this building. You had to go through the entry, but then just simply walk out. That wasn't the case. But in fact, you wanted people to turn 90 degrees within the room. And this was very important. And therefore, there's always a small step between each level. So there's always a step that you have to climb to move to the next room. Next slide. Next. Next, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next. And then we had a contract from Synthes, a pharmaceutical company, and there we had to look at barracks and convert them to create headquarters for Synthes, the pharmaceutical firm. And the watchtower itself was a heritage building, so we couldn't touch that. Next. Now, Solothurn is a very interesting Baroque city. You always have a diagonal axis here, as in the case in many Baroque cities. And then you have the buildings along the periphery. You have the cathedral, The founding stone of the cathedral is huge limestone. Limestone is something that's found all along this river. And then you have the city that is built in relation to this Baroque city. And now the new headquarters were supposed to be very close to the river. And then you have the existing watchtower that had to be conserved. And then you have two large parallel buildings that we could work with. So we had the watchtower extended through parking decks. You can park above, below, and in between. But basically, it was just a parking space, essentially. And now, some sketches to just see how things could work out. We had the watchtower. And thus you could see that this is something that was just in the middle of the site. And then we had an entryway from the river as well. Moving on. Now you also have the different elements that once again create this vertical association. And there, then at the back, you have the watchtower. This created a void for us in between these two parallel structures. Now, in the next slide, these are not exactly the trees that are there now, but of course, this is just a sketch. These are just, these are poplar trees that we have now. But this was always something that I kept remembering, that poplar actually is very bad wood and these trees often fall over, and that you should never have poplar trees near a parking garage. And so then I had to shelve that idea. Now here you have a view from the watchtower, and here you have the parking garage. We wanted to use the Jura limestone here. And then we had about a 2.5 meter space, after which you had the second facade. The second facade, nonetheless, is not completely congruent with the first facade. So the first facade looks along over this rural area, this large area, and the deeper facade in this figure actually associates with the people and the work areas. The watch tower was something that determined the length of the parking garages as well, and then you have open space in the middle between these two structures. Now, coming back to the typewriter. My love affair with architecture basically consists in a picture like this, where you have different points that create lines, that create elements. And because we will never be standing exactly in front of the building, you actually have different layers that actually create this multi-dimensional structure. Now, if you look at the watchtower, and if you look at which house is actually more unique, if you look at the build by Frank Gehry in Bilbao or the house here, what is actually more unique? Now, the issue in our profession, or at least the questions we must ask in our profession, is if I take all my materials and I place them in front of me and I actually forget the space that I'm in, then you cannot actually use these materials to create a specific effect. But if you create a space, you use these materials to create something that actually elicits specific reactions in the space, from the environment, from the landscape, that's when the creativity has come in. The creativity of the architect is looking at the sum of all the elements to use that as an abstract basis to create something specific.
Sehen Sie, was da geschehen ist? Natürlich wird dann das
Now,
aufgefüllt mit
of course,
Hauswänden
here the points are then filled up and joined.
und so weiter.
You have different rooms,
Eine Reihe Menschen,
bathrooms,
aber die
toilets,
Bäume
etc.
haben
Many different things here. But as you can see, also the trees have moved. We started with something very schematic, and then we have filled in details.
Das ist die Zeichnung im
Next slide, and here you have the plans
so quasi wie eine leichte Tektonik.
with the different tectonic elements. You have the parking spaces, the trees as well,
Im Erdgeschossplan
and the planning on the ground floor,
entlang
where we have a large boulevard,
und diese
large asymmetric boulevard along the river. And then you have an entry hall with a reception, informal meeting rooms, an auditorium, the toilets and the logistical areas.
Practical Exercise und hier ist die Schlosserei.
So the practical areas, and then you also have the different closures here.
Dann in den oberen Geschossen
And now on the
hat es den
upper floor,
Boulevard als Kommunikationsfläche
the boulevard
ausnutzt.
is a kind of way to join the different spaces in this building. And here it's through a corridor. So it's about 600 square meters here. So quite a lot of space we're working with. And then
Immer an den Stirnseiten gibt es
you have different working areas, and always at the head you have conference rooms.
die Gestalt für so ein großes Haus.
Now, how do you set up the form for such a big building?
Formuliert.
Or, to put it in other words, what are the usual habits
Fallen oder wo man
that we are confronted with in such a building?
hat
What must we have as habit in such buildings? So this drawing was a starting point,
Was Sie
really.
hier sehen,
What you can see here
ist eine vertikale,
is
ein Format und da hat
a vertical format,
ein Knoten.
and within this vertical format you have knots,
Damals mich
and that's the counterweight.
Jahrhunderte
At that point,
das
I was looking at these century-old classical lines
horizontale Basis, diese
where you create these vertical structures, where you have a shaft, you have a void, a shaft, a void.
auch muss ich
And if I want to create a different feeling, if I want to create a different effect, then I have to change things in a way and thus create a new
nicht unbedingt
order.
bekannte Art, wie man Pfeiler setzt, aber
Now, this is not a usual way in which lines are actually set up, but here using a void to create relief, that's quite a classical method.
dann haben wir hier eine Skizze,
And now here you have another
eine Zeichnung,
sketch,
ganz viele
small drawing.
Fassadenzeichnungen
I made a number of different such drawings for the facade
kennenzulernen.
to just try and get to know this language.
Hier, jetzt ist ein Kapitell
Here you can see
dahin gekommen und
you have a space, a column,
weiß, ob wir
a void,
großen geschichtlichen
and that's how we've been able to create this effect.
Dinge entdecken können.
It's quite interesting how in a large space you can keep rediscovering different elements, and that's something where mathematics is also quite amazing.
Auf der horizontalen
Now,
Knoten
here we've used the vertical and the horizontal, and we've joined them through knots at the meeting points.
sind nur noch die Knoten gezeigt.
Now here I've only drawn the knots, the meeting points.
Wäre die Frage, ob das Auge zu einem
And the question really is, would the eye be able to identify the verticality, and could these knots actually replace the vertical elements? And so then
Geschichte, wo man das
we tried to figure this out and see what we could
kann
do.
ja nicht tragen, das ist ein reines Blattwerk, das schwächste Teil am Bau.
And here you have the weakest part of the structure. And then you have the details in Solothurn, where we had the horizontal and the vertical coming together in these nodes, these knots. Now, here we had some prefabricated concrete columns, and that's how it looks. It's actually quite large. And then in reality, that's what you get. That's how the proportions actually stay together. And there you have the Jura limestone as well. And at the same time, you have these spaces in the middle between these limestone blocks. And then you have a line superimposed, creating these different nodes. And you can see how this is then in relationship with the plot itself. From my end, also just a bit of speculation really from my end, that if someone is in there, they would be able to figure out this line overarching the structure. Next slide.
Der Zugang und
Here, the access, you can see the knots, the limestone, the cement. Here, where the facade meets the bottom of the structure. And then you can see these outer parts where the gray color is translucent. Next slide. Next. A different source of inspiration that I wanted to share with you. Just like with the typewriter, here something different. I had this lying open on my table 2-3 years long. I just had this on my desk. And there's something I didn't understand. What was that? This is actually a very simple spatial construction by Matisse. But then you look outside, and this is something which interested me, but I didn't really see it with my eyes. I didn't perceive it correctly. And one day, I was able to see it. In architecture, this is the wall, and on the bottom is the floor. Matisse works with a black color from the ground floor up on the wall. The same with the white, quite contrary to the simplistic construction of the room. When I recognized this, all of my material perceptions of how space is constructed became completely free of any classical perceptions that I may have had before. I was able to see these spaces in a completely new way. I would have never been able to recognize this if I had only looked at architecture. What that means is we must look at relief, we must look at voids, we must also seek inspiration from other art forms, from painting. It is interesting how the painting here truly brought me to see it in a new way. And that is actually a step that one can take into a new history. And this is something which truly makes me so happy when I recognize these kind of things. This a bit back, if possible. No, excuse me, that's quite right. This is a very long house. In Switzerland, when a house is built, certain things are discussed. Certain things are discussed after the house has been built. The architect builds a certain building, and afterwards people were not consulted and they're unhappy. I really love it when from the start, if someone sees this building, shares his or her comments, his or her perception of the space that is being constructed before it is built. I have a special relationship with other forms of art. I also like to look at paintings, and it's truly an enrichment for me. And today, there are many, so to say, parasites in our walls. There are all types of things that we have now in modern buildings that we didn't used to have in antiquity, such as electricity, toilets. There were no electric light switches. It's wonderful how people were able to build in antiquity. What we have to do is we must use very small spaces where each square meter is of immense value. We need to work with these spaces. But we still have the task, and this is our art, to work with the main rooms, with the main 2 rooms, actually, in any building, and these need to be built in a balanced way. The modern physics of buildings are therefore very different from how things used to be built. And now we need to work with small spaces and big spaces and how these interact. In my own opinion, there are 3 types of buildings that I cannot build, because in one case, there's so much energy that I must waste to build this first type of building, to be able to be in line with how things used to be built, so I can't do that. Could we, from our present point in time, could we build like Corbusier or like Palacios? Well, if we could, that would be like lying on the beach. There would be no modern physics of buildings, big, fat walls, wonderful proportions, contractors who would work wonderfully and who would also discuss ideas with architects. We must feed so much energy into our projects that we call architectural projects, but actually we need to work with so many physical elements. And there we have to waste so much energy with these material elements that sometimes we forget what the art of architecture is. Now, if you look at this model, you can see the machines here, the practical exercise room, the kitchen, and then the ceiling, which is a free flow, and then there's this free flow entrance. Some of these spaces are built in a very open way. And here, in these rooms, the idea was to give young architects the possibility to work here and to put in place certain works with textiles. And that's what I did. I let younger architects work on the inside of these spaces, and that's what they did. And these textiles sort of brought the different spaces together. This is a staircase filled with light, which seems elevated in a room which is almost devoid of air. Next, please. Here we can see an informal auditorium. It can either be opened or closed, a versatile space. And here in the front, we can see this space. Some leather ornamentation was brought in. And we can see these works made of stencils. We can still admire the staircase further here. One moment, please. Can you see these? That is how thick the staircase is here. And just because it is so thick, we have studied this in depth. And we've studied this optically, how we can visually create this. You can see how the stone here is above the other part, the lighter part. And here, the upstairs, the uppermost floor. Here's a conference room. And the conference room is on the facade side. And all of the walls are walls which are fragmentary, and then there's glass in between. There's much light here. And this is an intimate space, but it's not a closed space. It's a space which is filled with light, and you can have a relationship with the outside space. You can see that there are certain lighter spaces and certain darker spaces. There's gray here on the wall. I have been also inspired by Jackson Pollock, by the collover. And I told the contractor that he could only use half of the material to create the gray here, so that there would be the all-over effect with the gray, with certain parts covered more and certain parts covered less. This wall is like a painting for me, and my source of inspiration was Jackson Pollock. Here, a few more indoor spaces, just like boys from the automobile world. You can see they're about this high. So in these open spaces, there's still a possibility for intimacy. It's not a box. It's a possibility to open an intimate space within an open space. So this is something which can be opened around your desk chair. And there's a possibility to create a divided space which protects the individual sitting at his or her desk. This is the staircase on the opposite side. There's a different language which is being exhibited here. And here we can see this space where everything is transparent and open. It's all held together in a very loose structure with wood. This is a large table for postal services. And here we can see these textiles which build these columns or pipes. And here you can see that this is cloth. And here, this is between the practical exercise and the other space. We can see that this is about 2.5 meters tall. This is the auditorium, open, transparent. Next, please. And here, once again, these pieces of cloth, these blinds. However, you can see that they stop at a certain height. Here, free flow. And here, this is the lodge. And we can look at the corners here. These corners are open, and we always have a view over the corner, over the other side of the corner. We can have a diagonal view, which is an absolute sensation when it works out the right way. And then there's this made of concrete. This is something which we built for a specific purpose. It is still light in a way. And there's a clear association of the human eye with something solid and something light. Next, please. Here we can really see the Baroque city and the river. The next project is from the canton Wallis. This is a region where there are many vineyards. We can see the specific landscape here. This is a sketch with hills, a river, and a pergola. And then there is a small path which goes downwards. There's wine, the winery there. There's a space for wine tasting, and the person also wanted to have a small exhibition space for art. This is a person who worked together with me. I always said, well, you do everything on the computer and I do everything by hand. But your design, which is done on a computer, must have the same or transmit the same emotion as my design, which I do by hand. That is, of course, much work on a computer. You can see here the pergola is gone. Here we can see the edges of the building and the inside spaces with an office, the space for wine tasting, informal auditorium, and the exhibition space. Everything is in an open space. One space goes into the other. And around this building, to make it seem like a big building, we worked with the landscape. We tried to work with these poles. We worked with these poles, which we placed at different places. Next, please. Next. This is limestone. And this is wet cement. And here we can see these pillars once again. If I could, I would always make cement wet. I find wet cement much more beautiful. However, unfortunately, cement in Switzerland is quite light colored. Next, please. Now to this shape. We're not only looking at architectural elements here, but we are also looking at these edges. And these edges truly capture the entire space of the landscape around it. We're able to simply take that landscape sort of as wings protecting it. This is the last project. This is a house quite near Synthes in the same valley. And here we can see the stables and a little tree that I planted. And here you can observe the topography. This was the first sketch. There is the street, and then it goes upwards, and there's the house. The idea here was to have a wall on 3 sides to make an intimate space, a space which is protected. That is what architecture does. You cut out a space, and then in that space, in urban planning, for example, you have a school, a hospital, and a house. Well, in Switzerland, in these valleys where wine is being grown, you have walls traditionally, and that is what I inspired my project on. This is the project as it is cut out. The people who wanted this built are musicians. They wanted a room to play their music. And I said I would like to create this room here on the left, the bigger room, which is the room for practicing music. And here we have a further sketch, the sketch in which we can see how the building is built on the natural topography of the landscape. And here, the big window is something which I didn't find so interesting. So therefore, I wanted to have certain elements in the wall which are fragments which throw shadows, and that creates an optical effect. This is the workshop up here. This is the workshop up on top. And then the access to that workshop on the top left. And then there's the hill upstairs, and then there are the rooms on the top. And then we can see that this, of course, works with the morphology of the landscape. On the top, there's the small bend. Here is the street which provides access to this building. And here we can see the entrance space where musical instruments will be displayed, and the workshop with a door in the shape of a V, and the various spaces around it. The wall is not straight because of the echo. The building works to avoid an echo. And here we can see very simple windows made of wood, and the stores. When the stores are pulled down, these blinds are pulled down, then it's very interesting for someone looking outside, from the inside out. Next, please. And this is the roof made of bitumen. And here we can see the rooms as they are placed parallel to the hill. This is the kitchen. The kitchen is actually movable. It can be placed on one side or on the other. The kitchen can be changed by its users as they please. Here, there's this wall which they painted white, and then we can see the color of the cement below, and we can also see the red bricks and the shape of the bricks behind. And here you can observe how all of the furniture builds a single unit, and there are no cut-up spaces within this inside space.
Here you have foam glass that's used for insulation, and this creates a different effect because it's directly placed on the material. Now, once again, a reference to things that I pick up on from art. Here, once again, you can see the painting by Matisse reflected here. Moving on, you have the shower, the toilet, and you can see, yes, coming back to the slide, you can see how everything has been kept open. The only electric fitting you have here is the general light. And here we've hidden the wires in this wood here. And this is the same material that was used for the roof as well. So the issue here was in Synthes, we had more money available. In Novartis as well, the budget was much larger. And here, we had to save 300,000 francs in one evening to just stay within the budget. So the question there really was, how do we achieve a certain effect? And how do I still do what I've been hired to do? How do I manage to create some sense and some emotion in these rooms? Do the materials evoke this effect? Is this just a variation of something? Or does it in fact represent more than something for an international company? What does it represent here for these musicians, for example? I would clearly state that art has nothing to do with money. And now when I'm thinking here, you can see that you're achieving a similar effect, be it here on a low budget project or in Novartis or Synthes. Now, you can say that you don't like something, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. Of course, it's very clear. There are many things that I myself didn't like. And then often I had to correct myself. Okay, I might not like it, but it's still good. Because it serves a purpose. It does what it's setting out to do.